January 10th, 1888. The sheriff stood over what used to be a family. Ice crystals still clung to the father's beard, where he'd frozen mid-breath, one arm wrapped around his wife, the other reaching for their daughter who lay 3 feet away in a drift. The child's eyes were open. She'd been 7. 17 bodies in this county alone. The count would climb to 300 before the thaw revealed them all. 4 miles west, smoke rose from a hillside where no house should be, the only chimney still breathing in a landscape of collapsed roofs and buried dreams. Inside that impossible warmth, 8 people who should have died were learning what it meant to be saved by the thing everyone had mocked. But that salvation began 8 months earlier with a widow and a pickaxe, and the kind of stubbornness that looks like madness until it saves your life. April 1887. Montana Territory. The funeral lasted 11 minutes. Reverend Colton spoke the words he'd spoken over 63 other graves that year, Robert Thornhill's name just another entry in the ledger of men who'd misjudged winter's reach. The coffin went into frozen ground that fought every shovel stroke, and Maggie Thornhill stood watching with eyes that hadn't produced tears since the search parties gave up in February. She'd known he was dead by the end of the first week. Felt it the way you feel weather changing in your bones, that certainty that needs no proof. But she'd kept a candle burning in the cabin window until the April thaw brought his body up from the ravine trap line still clutched in frozen hands and made the knowing official. The mourners filed past with their practiced condolences, already thinking about planting season and fence repairs and all the living concerns that couldn't wait for grief. By May, they'd stopped asking how she was managing. By June, they'd stopped asking anything at all. The cabin Robert built had walls thin enough to read newsprint through when the sun hit right. Last winter, Maggie burned every chair, both bed frames, the kitchen table he'd been so proud of, and still woke most mornings with ice crystallized in her hair from her own frozen breath. The fireplace Robert installed drew smoke about, as well as a sieve held water, and the roof leaked in 7 places she'd counted, probably more she hadn't. She could have sold the claim. Could have moved to Helena or Butte, found work in a boarding house or laundry, traded her independence for 4 walls someone else maintained. That's what sensible widows did. What respectable widows did. Maggie was done being sensible. Her father had been a tin miner in Cornwall, England. 3 brothers, all of them spending their lives crawling through tunnels carved into the earth's skin, coming home with rock dust in their lungs and stories about the underground chambers that stayed 55 degrees year-round, regardless of what hell the surface weather conjured. She'd visited the old Bodelac mine as a girl, descended into that strange quiet, where the world's chaos couldn't follow, felt the steady coolness that asked nothing and took nothing and simply was. Surface world hostile, unpredictable, deadly. Underground world stable, constant, safe. Robert had laughed when she'd suggested building a root cellar their first year on the claim. "We're not moles, Margaret. We're people. People live above ground." He'd been a good man, loyal and kind and utterly conventional, and he'd been wrong about more things than she'd realized while he was alive, including apparently how to navigate a snow-covered ravine in February. The first time Maggie struck her pickaxe into the hillside behind the mining claim, her golden retriever Rusty raised his head from where he'd been dozing in the afternoon suntail, thumping once against the dry grass as if to say, "Finally, something interesting." The second swing sent a shock up her arms that promised blisters by sunset. The third opened a gash in the hillside about 6 inches deep, revealing clay the color of old blood. She was on her 19th swing when Daniel Brennan rode up on his gray mare, reined in 10 yards back, and watched in silence for a full 10 minutes before speaking. "You know there's no gold in that hill. The prospectors checked it years ago. Nothing but clay and rock." Maggie didn't stop swinging. "I'm not looking for gold." "Then what in hell are you doing building a home?" Brennan's laugh came out sharp and dismissive, the sound of a man who'd already made up his mind about what he was seeing. "A home in a hill. Ma'am, with respect, your husband left you a cabin not 200 yards from here. It's got 4 walls, a roof, and a fireplace. What more does a woman need?" Maggie paused, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. She looked at Brennan with eyes that had buried a husband and burned furniture for warmth, and stopped caring what men who'd never frozen in their own homes thought about anything. "My husband is dead, Mr. Brennan. The cabin he built has walls so thin I can hear the wind laughing at me through every crack. Last winter I burned every stick of furniture we owned just to keep from freezing, and I still woke up with ice in my hair. This winter I'm going to sleep warm, and I'm going to do it underground where the cold can't reach me." Brennan shook his head slowly, the way men do when they've decided a woman has lost her mind and there's no point arguing. "Suit yourself, Mrs. Thornhill, but when that tunnel collapses on your head, don't expect anyone to dig you out." He rode away without looking back, and Maggie returned to her work. The pickaxe rose and fell. The hill slowly opened. Rusty sat watching tail-brushing autumn leaves, waiting for his human to build them a place where winter couldn't follow. The first 3 feet were the worst. Topsoil packed with roots that fought every swing, stones the size of her head, buried just beneath the surface where they could shatter a pickaxe blade if you hit them wrong. Her hands blistered by the end of day 1, bled by day 2, blistered again over the wounds by day 3. On day 4, her pickaxe snapped clean through the handle, the iron head spinning off into the excavation like a judgment. She'd need a new one, which meant a trip to town, which meant facing the questions and the stares and the pity that felt more like contempt with better manners. The trading post owner Samuel Grissom looked at her broken tool, and then at her blistered hands, and then at her face with an expression that said he already knew the whole story. "Digging that hole in the hillside, I hear. Building a home. Same thing way I see it. You got money for a new pickaxe?" Maggie set her wedding ring on the counter. 14-karat gold, scratched from 5 years of frontier living, but still solid, still worth something to someone. It's worth more than a pickaxe. Grissom picked it up, examined it in the light from the window, set it back down. "Ma'am, I can't take your wedding ring for a tool." "Why not?" "Because it ain't right. Mr. Grissom, my husband, is dead, and I'm not remarrying. That ring is just metal to me now, and I need a pickaxe more than I need sentiment. Are we trading or not?" He gave her the pickaxe, and $2 change wouldn't meet her eyes when he did it, and Maggie walked out of that store feeling lighter than she had in months. She'd traded grief for function, memory for survival, and every step back to her claim felt like shedding skin she didn't need anymore. By the end of week 2, she had a horizontal gash in the hillside 4 feet deep and 6 feet wide. The neighbors had started riding by more frequently, finding excuses to check fences or track strays or pursue any business that happened to route them past the widow Thornhill's claim so they could witness the spectacle. Catherine Jensen, who lived 3 miles east and considered herself an expert on everything, despite evidence suggesting otherwise, rode up one afternoon with her husband Eric trailing behind on their plow horse. "It'll flood. The spring snowmelt will fill that hole like a bathtub and drown everything inside." Maggie kept digging. "The roof will cave in," Eric added. He was a large man who spoke little but felt obligated to confirm whatever his wife said. "Earth isn't meant to hang over empty space. God made ceilings out of wood and stone, not dirt. She'll hit rock and have to give up," predicted Tom Fletcher, the 19-year-old who worked as a hand on Brennan's ranch. "My pa tried to dig a well once and hit granite at 8 feet. Broke 2 pickaxes and gave up." Maggie listened to all of them, thanked them for their concern, kept digging. Week 3 brought different earth. Dense clay that held its shape when she carved it, that didn't crumble or collapse, that smelled of ancient dampness and patient geology. This was what she'd been hoping for. Clay was a tunnel builder's friend. It compressed under its own weight instead of falling. It sealed against water better than any mortar men had invented. She began shaping the space more deliberately now. The entrance tunnel she kept narrow, just wide enough for her shoulders angled slightly upward from outside to inside, so water would drain out instead of pooling. 10 feet in, she started widening the excavation, carving an oval chamber that would eventually measure 12 feet deep, 10 feet wide, 7 feet tall at the center. The shoring came next. She'd traded 3 months of butter and eggs to the sawmill owner for a stack of pine logs and spent 4 days cutting them to length and fitting them into place. Vertical posts every 4 feet along the walls. Horizontal beams across the ceiling notched to lock into the posts. The frame created a skeleton that would hold even if the earth decided to settle. She learned to measure twice and cut once. Learned the sound of wood under stress, the creak that meant a beam was bearing weight properly versus the groan that meant something was about to fail. Learned that precision wasn't optional when the ceiling over your head was held up by your own calculations. On a Tuesday in late September, one of her early ceiling beams split along a hidden crack she'd missed during installation. It dropped 6 inches before the neighboring beams caught the load, and Maggie's heart stopped for the 2 seconds it took to realize the whole structure wasn't coming down. She replaced that beam the same day, working until her arms shook and her vision blurred because a single weak point could bring down everything she'd built. Between the logs, she packed clay mixed with straw from Robert's old barn. The mixture would dry into a surface nearly as hard as brick, stabilizing the walls and creating a smooth interior that would resist moisture and stay clean. She'd learned about clay straw construction from a book in the territorial library about ancient buildings in places with names she couldn't pronounce. Turned out people had been building underground homes for thousands of years. It was just that here in 1887 Montana Territory folks had forgotten how. By early October, Tom Fletcher started visiting with questions instead of predictions of failure. He'd show up after his work at Brennan's ranch watching Maggie fit beams or pack clay, and after a while he'd ask about angles or load distribution or why she was doing things the way she was doing them. "How do you know the beam won't crack like that first one did?" "I don't know for certain. But I check every piece for flaws before I install it, and I cut each beam 10% thicker than the calculation says I need. That's the margin that keeps you alive when your math is wrong. You learned all this from books. Books and my father's stories and trial and error. Mostly error." Tom was quiet for a moment, watching her work. "I mocked you when you started this." Rode by with the other hands and laughed. "I remember. I'm sorry for that." Maggie set down her mallet, studied the young man who'd just given her something she hadn't expected. Apology accepted. "Now hand me that support post before this beam decides it doesn't like hanging in midair." He stayed until sunset helping her brace the ceiling structure, and when he left he didn't make jokes with the other ranch hands anymore about the crazy widow digging her grave. The fireplace was the most technically demanding part of the entire structure. She built it against the back wall with stones hauled from a creek bed 2 miles away, each one selected for how it would fit with its neighbors. The firebox itself was small, barely 2 feet wide, but in an enclosed underground space a small fire would generate more heat than any cabin stove. The chimney was the engineering challenge. It had to rise through 7 feet of earth at an angle steep enough to draw smoke up, but gradual enough to prevent collapse. She based the design on ventilation systems from Cornish tin mines, where moving air through underground passages was literally the difference between miners living and dying. She built the chimney in sections fitting stones around a temporary wooden form that she'd remove once the mortar set. The angle was 28 degrees from vertical, emerging from the hillside, 20 feet above, and 10 feet to the left of her entrance tunnel. When she finally knocked out the wooden form and lit her first test fire, smoke rose cleanly up and out, and no backdraft pushed it into her chamber. Daniel Brennan came by that same evening, drawn by the sight of smoke rising from a hillside where no chimney should exist. "Can I see inside?" She handed him a lantern. "Mind your head at the entrance. It opens up once you're past the first few feet." He ducked through the doorway and disappeared. For a long moment there was silence. Then his voice echoed back, muffled by earth and surprise. "Good Lord." When he emerged, his expression had changed entirely. The dismissiveness was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like respect, or at least the beginning of it. "It's warm in there. Must be 15-20 degrees warmer than out here. 55 degrees. Maggie kept her voice matter-of-fact. "The Earth maintains that temperature year-round at this depth. Cooler than a summer day, warmer than a winter night. It's physics, Mr. Brennan, not magic. You built a fireplace underground. The chimney vents through the hillside. The smoke rises naturally. The angle prevents backdrafts. I could show you the diagrams if you're interested." Brennan stared at her as if seeing her for the first time, reassessing every assumption he'd made since that first day watching her swing a pickaxe. "Mrs. Thornhill, I owe you an apology. When you started this project, I thought—" He paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound like the insult they were. "I thought you were making a mistake. You weren't alone. I was wrong. This is remarkable. This is something else entirely." He rode away slowly, looking back twice before disappearing around the bend in the trail, and Maggie permitted herself a small smile before going back inside to finish installing the wooden bed frame she'd been working on. November brought snow, and the snow brought visitors. Catherine Jensen, her earlier predictions of flooding forgotten, rode up with questions about ventilation systems because the Jensen farmhouse chimney had collapsed under wet snow and they were rebuilding before the real cold set in. Then Eric Jensen came asking if Maggie might sell some of her stockpiled firewood because their supply had gotten wet when the woodshed roof leaked and wet wood burned poorly if it burned at all. Then others came. Families from surrounding claims who'd heard about the underground shelter and wanted to see it for themselves, wanted to understand how a widow had built something that seemed to defy common sense and physics both. Maggie gave tours when she had time, explained earth insulation and thermal mass to anyone who would listen. Most nodded politely and left confused. A few asked intelligent questions and stayed to learn. Through it all, she continued improving her home. She laid plank flooring over packed earth, creating a surface that would stay clean and dry, built shelves into the walls for storage, hung bundles of pine branches from ceiling beams partly for the fresh scent, partly because the resin had mild antiseptic properties that would help keep the air from going stale. Rusty had claimed his spot immediately the first night she'd moved her bedroll inside. A worn blanket beside the fireplace where he could watch both the flames and the tunnel entrance, guardian of this strange new den his human had created. By early December, the shelter was complete. Maggie moved in on the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, and slept more peacefully than she had since Robert died. The earth wrapped around her like a promise, holding warmth close while the surface world turned hostile above. 3 days before Christmas, Tom Fletcher showed up at her door after dark, which was unusual enough that Maggie grabbed the rifle Robert had left her before opening. "Mrs. Thornhill, I need to tell you something." She lowered the rifle but didn't set it down. "What is it Daniel Brennan's been asking questions around town? About underground construction. Bought a load of timber 2 weeks ago and digging tools last week. I rode by his place yesterday and saw fresh excavation behind his barn. The pieces fell into place with the weight of confirmation. So he's building his own shelter?" "Yes, ma'am, but he hasn't told anyone. Acts like it's just ranch maintenance when folks ask. I thought you should know." "Why?" "Because Tom's voice carried an edge of anger Maggie hadn't heard before. He mocked you all summer while you built this. Called you crazy, same as everyone else. Now he's copying your design and won't admit it because he's too proud to say a woman was right." Maggie set the rifle against the wall, considering. "Or he's ashamed. Those aren't always different things." The next morning she rode to Brennan's ranch, found him exactly where Tom had said, behind his barn 3 feet down in an excavation that followed the same principles she'd used. Entrance tunnel at an upward angle. Clay walls. Timber framing already started. He saw her coming and straightened pickaxe in hand, dirt on his clothes, and no room left for pretending this was anything other than what it was. "Mrs. Thornhill, Mr. Brennan, building a home." His jaw worked like he was chewing words he didn't want to swallow. "My cattle barn has gaps in the walls. Lost 6 head to cold last winter. This winter I won't. Because you'll have an underground shelter." "Yes, based on my design." He could have lied. Could have claimed he'd thought of it independently or learned it from a book or any of the face-saving fictions men use when admitting a woman was right feels like losing something important. Instead, he set down his pickaxe and met her eyes. "Yes. Based on your design. I mocked you for months, and you were right and I was wrong, and now I'm stealing your idea because I don't want to freeze to death or lose more cattle, and I'm too ashamed to admit publicly that I copied the crazy widow. So there it is. You can tell the whole county if you want. I deserve it." Maggie studied him, saw the rigid pride that had kept him skeptical, saw the fear underneath that had finally broken through. Saw a man who'd lost his wife 3 years ago in childbirth and had been alone ever since, hardening into someone who trusted nothing new because new things kept taking what he loved. "Your ventilation is wrong. The angle's too shallow. Smoke will pool at the first bend and backdraft into your chamber. I know. I can't figure out how you solved it. 28 degrees from vertical. Any shallower and you get pooling. Any steeper and the structure's unstable. She paused. I can show you the calculations if you want. Why would you help me after because when the real cold comes, we'll all need to survive. Pride is colder than any winter, Mr. Brennan. She spent 3 hours that afternoon sharing her ventilation diagrams, her beam measurements, her hard-won knowledge about which mistakes were survivable and which ones would kill you. Brennan listened like a man memorizing gospel, taking notes in the margins of her drawings, asking questions that showed he understood the stakes. When she left, he stood at his excavation site, holding her diagrams like they were made of something more valuable than paper. Mrs. Thornhill. Thank you. Build it right, Mr. Brennan. And when people ask where you learned it, you tell them the truth. Not for my sake, for theirs. Knowledge that could save lives shouldn't die from pride. The first week of November brought hard frost that killed 2 of Brennan's calves overnight, despite the shelter he was building not being finished yet. The Jensen farm discovered their root cellar had flooded during the fall rains, rotting half their winter vegetable stores. Tom Fletcher's father finally struck water in his well after months of digging, but it came up brackish and undrinkable, contaminated by some underground mineral deposit nobody had known existed. Meanwhile, Maggie's shelter stayed dry, stable, and increasingly warm as she brought the fireplace into regular use. Word continued to spread. The crazy widow's hole in the ground was holding up better than most of the conventional structures in the county. By late November, Daniel Brennan had finished his own underground shelter using Maggie's principles but adapting them to his larger space needs. He needed room for supplies for storage for the possibility of sheltering livestock if a bad storm hit. His chamber was 15 feet by 12 ceiling, reinforced with double beams, chimney following the exact 28-degree angle Maggie had specified. The first time he tested his fireplace, he rode to Maggie's claim to report success. It draws perfectly. No smoke backup. Temperature inside is 56 degrees with no fire, 58 with a small one. Good. You built it right. I built it the way you taught me. He paused, then said what he'd ridden over to say. I've been defending you in town. When Eric Jensen called you unnatural, when Samuel Grissom said women shouldn't be living alone on remote claims, when folks talk like your husband dying somehow makes you less capable of thinking straight. I tell them you're the only one thinking straight, and if they had any sense, they'd be building what you built instead of mocking what they don't understand. I appreciate that, Mr. Brennan. I wish I'd said it sooner. He rode away before she could respond, and Maggie stood at her shelter entrance watching the first significant snow of the season begin to fall, thick flakes that meant winter was finally arriving in earnest. She was installing the last of her ceiling reinforcements on a cold Tuesday in early December when the beam split. Not a small crack. A full break, the sound like a gunshot in the enclosed space, the beam dropping 6 inches and taking her improvised scaffold with it. She fell hard wood collapsing beneath her, and when she tried to move, her right leg wouldn't respond properly. Not broken. She'd broken bones before and knew what that felt like, but pinned under one of the fallen scaffold supports wedged at an angle that made extraction impossible without leverage she didn't have. Rusty started barking immediately, that frantic alarm bark that meant something was badly wrong. Maggie tried to shift the beam herself, got her hands under it, pushed with everything she had. It moved perhaps an inch before the weight proved too much. Above her, the ceiling groaned, other beams taking load. They weren't meant to carry the whole structure, suddenly unstable because of the one failure she'd tried so hard to prevent. This is how I die. The thought arrived with crystalline clarity. Buried like Robert. The town was right. I was crazy to think I could do this. Rusty disappeared up the entrance tunnel, still barking, and Maggie lay in the half-darkness listening to wood stress and trying to calculate how long she had before the ceiling came down entirely. Minutes, maybe. Possibly less. She heard horse hooves, heard Tom Fletcher's voice calling her name, heard Rusty barking louder, more insistent, the kind of noise that said, "Follow me, something's wrong. Come help." Mrs. Thornhill. Tom appeared in the entrance tunnel, took in the scene with one glance. Maggie pinned, ceiling sagging, the imminent collapse written in the angle of every beam. Don't move, I'm coming. If you come in here, the weight might trigger full collapse. Then we'll both die quick, instead of you dying slow." He moved into the chamber, assessing the structural situation with the kind of practical intelligence that came from working on ranches where one wrong move with a spooked horse or unstable load could kill you. "I'm going to brace that ceiling beam with my back. When I do, you crawl out from under the scaffold. Can you move if you're not pinned? I think so." "You think or you know, I know." "Then we're doing this on 3. 1, 2, 3. Tom positioned himself under the sagging beam, took the weight onto his shoulders with a grunt that spoke of serious pain being endured without complaint. The ceiling lifted perhaps 4 inches. Not much. Enough. Maggie dragged herself free, her legs screaming but functional, and the moment she cleared the debris, Tom released the beam and dove sideways. It crashed down exactly where Maggie had been trapped, and the whole ceiling shuddered but held. They lay on the floor, breathing hard, and after a moment Maggie started laughing. Not humor. Shock and relief and the manic joy of people who'd just escaped death by margins too thin to contemplate. Tom sat up still, breathing hard. "Mrs. Thornhill, you didn't dig all summer to die in here. Don't do that again. I'll add it to my list of things to avoid." He helped her stand. Her leg would bruise spectacularly, but nothing was torn or broken. Tom examined the ceiling damage with the eye of someone who now understood what he was looking at. "You need to replace this beam and reinforce the ones next to it. Today. Before the weight shifts again." "I know. I'll help you." They worked until sunset, Tom following Maggie's instructions with the precision of someone who'd seen exactly how bad things could get when construction failed. They pulled out the broken beam, installed a replacement cut from the spare timber Maggie had stored outside, reinforced the neighboring supports with additional bracing. By the time they finished, the ceiling was stronger than it had been before the failure. Tom sat on the floor afterward, examining his hands, which were developing blisters to match the ones Maggie had earned months ago. "I need to tell you something. I've been carrying it since your husband died, and it's gotten heavier every day." Maggie waited. "2 winters ago I stole tools from your husband's barn. A good saw, a set of chisels, a hand drill. I was young and stupid and broke, and I told myself he'd never miss them. But he did miss them. He told my pa he was short on tools, and was that why his fence work was going slow. My pa believed him. I let him believe it. And 3 months later your husband was out checking trap lines, probably looking for those tools because he thought maybe he'd left them somewhere, and he fell and died. If I hadn't stolen from him, maybe he wouldn't have been out there that day. Maybe he'd still be alive." The words sat in the space between them, heavy and true, and impossible to take back. "You think you killed my husband? I think I'm part of why he died. And you saved my life today anyway." Maggie considered this young man who'd mocked her and then learned from her, and then just put his own life at risk to save hers. Considered Robert, who'd been checking trap lines for a dozen reasons that had nothing to do with stolen tools, who'd died because snow and steep slopes and bad timing are what kill people in winter, not missing equipment. "Robert's gone. Hating you won't bring him back. But you just kept this ceiling from crushing me, so I'd say we're even." Tom looked at her like she'd just handed him something he didn't know how to hold. "I don't deserve that." "Probably not." Maggie's voice was gentle but firm. "But here's what you do deserve. You deserve to learn from this. You deserve to carry it forward and be better. And you deserve to not die stupid when you could live smart instead. So here's what we're going to do. You're going to help me finish reinforcing this shelter. I'm going to teach you everything I know about underground construction. And when winter comes and you need somewhere to shelter if your father's place fails, you know where to find warmth." He stayed until full dark, helping her brace every questionable beam, checking every joint, making the shelter as close to collapse-proof as human engineering could achieve. When he left, he didn't ride with the weight of a man carrying guilt. He rode with the purpose of someone who'd been given a second chance and intended to earn it. Mid-December brought unusual warmth, temperatures climbing into the 40s when they should have been in the teens. Old Dawson, the prospector, who'd been working Montana Territory since before it was Montana Territory, stopped by Maggie's shelter one afternoon with a warning that sat in his eyes like weather. "This warm spell ain't natural, Mrs. Thornhill. The cold's been gathering strength somewhere. When it breaks, it'll break hard. How hard? He looked at the horizon with the expression of someone reading text written in wind and air pressure and the behavior of animals who knew things humans had forgotten. Worse than anything we've seen in 20 years. Maybe worse than anything anyone's seen. You got supplies a month's worth. Food, water, firewood. Make it 6 weeks if you can. And tell anyone who'll listen to do the same. He rode off without waiting for a response, and Maggie stood at her shelter entrance watching birds that should have been abundant flying south in numbers that suggested evacuation rather than migration. The cattle in distant pastures were huddling despite the warm weather, bunching tight like prey animals anticipating predators. She doubled her firewood stores, rationed her current food to stretch it further, and traded for additional supplies. Checked every seal on her door, every gap in her chimney, every possible point where cold could infiltrate. On the evening of January 6, 1888, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 3 hours. The sky turned greenish-gray, a color Maggie had never seen before and hoped never to see again. The wind died completely, leaving a silence so profound it felt like the world holding its breath. Rusty paced the shelter entrance, whining softly, every animal instinct he possessed screaming danger. Maggie stood outside her shelter as sunset approached, watching the horizon where something dark and terrible was gathering. The storm was coming, and it was going to be worse than anyone imagined. She went inside, sealed the door, stacked extra firewood within arm's reach of the fireplace, and waited for winter to show its teeth. January 7, 1888. Morning. Maggie woke to silence. Not the quiet of a calm day, but the oppressive hush of a world holding its breath before screaming. No wind, no bird song. The kind of nothing that preceded everything going wrong. She opened her shelter door to air that felt wrong against her skin. 12 degrees by her thermometer, which wasn't terrible for January in Montana territory, but the sky pressed down like a lid on a pot about to boil over. Solid gray from horizon to horizon, the color of dirty ice and bad intentions. Rusty refused to leave the shelter. Stood at the entrance with his hackles raised, whining low in his throat, every instinct bred into him over 10,000 years of domestication, overridden by something older that knew when to hide. Maggie checked her supplies one final time. Food for 6 weeks if she rationed carefully. Water from the spring seeping through the back wall, cold and clean and reliable. Firewood stacked to the ceiling along the north side of the chamber, seasoned pine and oak that would burn hot and steady. The rifle Robert had left her loaded and within reach. Everything she needed to wait out whatever was coming. She sealed the door at noon. Double-checked every gap in the frame, every potential infiltration point where cold could slip through. The fireplace drew perfectly, smoke rising up and out through the angled chimney that had taken her 3 attempts to build correctly. Temperature inside 56 degrees with no fire burning. Physics and earth insulation holding steady while the surface world prepared to turn hostile. 4 miles north. James Morrison stood in his kitchen watching his daughter Lucy arrange her school primer and slate on the table, practicing her letters with the fierce concentration of a 6-year-old determined to prove she could read as well as the older children. His wife Elizabeth stood at the window studying the sky with an expression that made James's chest tighten. That doesn't look right. It's January. Sky never looks right in January. He tried to make his voice carry more confidence than he felt. She can't miss school every time it's cloudy. This isn't cloudy. This is something else. Lucy looked up from her slate, sensing the tension in her parents' voices the way children do. Am I going to school or not? James made the decision that would define everything that followed. Of course you're going. It's 4 miles. We've made that ride 100 times. You'll be fine. Elizabeth didn't argue, but her silence carried weight. 3 miles west. Anna Walsh sat in her cabin nursing her infant son Peter, worried about the firewood supply that was running lower than it should with 6 weeks of winter still ahead. Her husband had died of pneumonia the previous March, leaving her with a 2-month-old and a claim she couldn't work alone, and neighbors who helped when they could, but had their own concerns. The fireplace had been smoking all morning. Not badly, just enough to make her eyes water and her throat itch. Wind backing down the chimney, probably, though there wasn't any wind. just that oppressive silence that made Peter fussy and difficult to settle. She'd burn through the rest of her firewood by February at this rate. Would have to start breaking up furniture after that the way Maggie Thornhill had done last winter before building that underground shelter everyone had mocked until recently. Anna had visited the shelter 2 weeks ago, curious about what the widow had accomplished, had stood in that oval chamber feeling the steady warmth and thinking about how different her winter might be if she'd had the knowledge or the strength or the sheer bloody-minded determination to dig herself into a hillside and build something that made sense. Now she sat by her smoking fireplace with a fussy baby and diminishing firewood and no husband to help shoulder the burden, and watched the sky turn colors she'd never seen before. At Brennan's ranch, Tom Fletcher was checking fence lines when the temperature dropped. Not gradually, not the normal cooling that happened as the sun climbed toward noon. One moment it was 12 degrees and manageable. The next it was -15, and his horse was panicking beneath him, eyes rolling white hooves, scrambling for purchase on ground that was icing over as he watched. The wind rose from nothing to 45 miles per hour in the span of 3 breaths. Snow began falling sideways, not gentle flakes, but ice crystals that stung like thrown gravel. Visibility collapsed from miles to yards to nothing in less time than it took Tom to dismount and try to orient himself. He couldn't see the fence line he'd been following, couldn't see his horse which had bolted the moment his weight left the stirrup. Couldn't see anything except white chaos and the growing certainty that he'd just become one of those statistics people would count after the thaw. The wind hit 50 miles per hour. 60. Sounds that didn't belong to weather freight train roars and shrieking that made his bones vibrate. Temperature plunging past -20, -30 wind chill, turning air into a weapon that attacked exposed skin with surgical precision. Tom wrapped his scarf over his face and started walking in what he hoped was the direction of shelter. Any shelter, because staying still meant freezing and freezing meant dying. At the schoolhouse 4 miles from the Morrison claim, the teacher, Miss Sarah Pritchard, watched the temperature plummet and made her own calculation. 17 children in her care ages 5 to 14. Parents scattered across claims spanning 20 square miles. Storm approaching faster than anything she'd seen in 8 years of frontier teaching. She could dismiss school early and send children home into what was rapidly becoming a whiteout. Or she could keep them here and hope parents came to collect them before conditions got worse. She chose wrong. By the time parents started arriving, visibility was down to arm's length, and horses were refusing to face into the wind. James Morrison fought his way to the schoolhouse, found Lucy huddled with 3 other children in the corner where the stove provided the most heat, and knew immediately that the return trip would be the most dangerous 4 miles of his life. He wrapped Lucy in every spare blanket the schoolhouse possessed, carried her outside into wind that tried to tear her from his arms, and started walking because his horse had broken free and bolted hours ago. He made it 2 miles before his strength gave out. Found a fallen timber that provided minimal windbreak curled around his daughter to share what warmth his body could generate, and prayed Elizabeth would forgive him for the decision that had brought them here. Maggie sat in her shelter listening to the world end above her. The roar started at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a sound like nothing she'd experienced, whine that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The earth around her transmitted the violence, a thrumming that she felt through the floor and walls, the planet itself vibrating with the force of weather that exceeded all reasonable bounds. Temperature outside -40 by her estimate, probably colder. Wind speed unknowable but catastrophic. Inside her shelter 56 degrees and steady. She fed small pieces of wood to her fire, just enough to supplement the earth's natural insulation, and tried not to think about the people who hadn't prepared, who were huddling in cabins with thin walls and inadequate heating, and no understanding that this storm would kill them if they didn't have somewhere better to be. At 4 o'clock she noticed the fireplace wasn't drawing correctly. Smoke that should have risen cleanly up the chimney was hesitating, pooling near the ceiling, beginning to drift back into the chamber. She stood, studied the fire's behavior, felt the first cold touch of real fear. The chimney was blocked. Snow or ice driven by that impossible wind had packed into the exit point 20 feet above, sealing it closed. And if she couldn't fix it, she had 2 choices: let the fire die and freeze, or keep burning and suffocate. Neither option was acceptable. She considered waiting, hoping the wind would shift and clear the blockage naturally. But the roar outside wasn't diminishing. If anything, it was intensifying, and smoke was already making her eyes water. She had perhaps an hour before the air in the chamber became unbreathable, perhaps less. Going outside in negative 40-degree weather with 60-mile-per-hour winds was suicide. Staying inside with a blocked chimney was suicide slightly slower. Maggie had survived her husband's death and a summer of mockery and a ceiling collapse that nearly buried her. She hadn't dug this far into the earth just to suffocate in her own shelter because she was too afraid to face weather. She began layering every piece of clothing she owned: 2 pairs of wool socks, long underwear, 2 dresses, Robert's old coat that she'd kept for sentimental reasons and was now grateful she hadn't burned, scarf wrapped around her face until only her eyes showed, gloves with mittens over them, a rope tied around her waist, the other end secured to a ceiling beam. Rusty watched with ears pinned back, understanding that something terrible was happening, but unable to articulate the warning that screamed through every fiber of his being. "Don't go out there." "I'll be back." Her voice was muffled through the scarf, but steady. "You stay here and guard our home." She opened the door and the world tried to kill her immediately. The wind hit like a physical blow, strong enough to stagger her backward into the tunnel. Snow so thick she couldn't see her own hands. Temperature that flash froze the moisture in her eyes, turning her vision to ice-rimmed slits. Cold that didn't just bite, but devoured, attacking every square inch of exposed skin with intent to harm. She stepped out anyway, pulled the door closed behind her so the wind couldn't fill her shelter with snow and ice, began climbing the hillside toward where the chimney exit should be 20 feet up and 10 feet to the left, using the rope as insurance against getting lost in whiteout conditions 3 yards from her own door. The wind tried to tear her off the hillside. She went to her knees, crawling now, feeling ahead with hands that were already going numb despite 2 layers of protection. The world had collapsed to white chaos and screaming wind and cold so profound it felt like burning. She found the chimney by smell. Smoke seeping from around the blockage, the acrid scent of her own fire trying to escape through ice. Her hands found the exit point completely packed with snow that had frozen solid, a plug of ice 2 feet thick, sealing what should have been open air. She had nothing to clear it with except the wooden probe she'd brought, a 4-foot length of pine whittled to a point. Metal tools would freeze to her skin instantly. Bare hands would give her frostbite in seconds. She had perhaps 10 minutes outside before her core temperature dropped to dangerous levels. She started chipping at the ice plug, each strike of the wooden probe sending shock-up arms that were losing sensation. The wind shrieked around her. Snow accumulated on her back and shoulders, building weight that threatened to pull her down the hillside. The rope around her waist was her only connection to survival, a tether to the shelter she could no longer see, despite being 20 feet away. 8 minutes. Her hands were wooden blocks at the ends of her arms, barely capable of gripping the probe. The ice plug was beginning to crack, but nowhere near clear. 9 minutes. She couldn't feel her feet anymore. Her face was a mask of ice where breath had frozen against the scarf. Vision narrowing to a tunnel body beginning to shut down non-essential functions to preserve the core. 9.5 minutes. The probe punched through. She felt the resistance give way, felt updraft as trapped smoke found escape, felt warmth bleeding up from the chimney below where her fire was still burning. She used the last of her strength to widen the hole, clearing enough of the blockage that smoke could flow freely. Then she turned and followed the rope back, hand over hand, crawling, because standing was beyond her capability now, following the only path to warmth because her vision had failed completely, and the world was just white and cold, and the growing certainty that she'd waited too long. Her hands found the door. Couldn't grip the handle. Couldn't make her frozen fingers close around wood and pull. She leaned against it with her whole body weight, and it swung inward, and she fell into the entrance tunnel and lay there shaking so violently her teeth cracked against each other. Rusty was licking her face, whining, trying to wake her from cold that felt like sleep. She crawled the last 10 feet into the chamber, kicked the door closed, and collapsed beside the fireplace that was now drawing perfectly smoke rising cleanly through the cleared chimney, while heat filled the space she'd nearly died to preserve. It took 2 hours before she could stop shaking, 3 before she could unwrap the frozen outer layers and see the damage. Her fingers were white up to the second knuckle, early-stage frostbite, but not severe enough for tissue death if she warmed them carefully. Her face, where the scarf had shifted, would blister but heal. Her feet were the worst frost-nipped toes that would hurt for weeks but probably wouldn't require amputation. She sat wrapped in every blanket she owned, feeding small pieces of wood to a fire that now meant life instead of just warmth, and realized she'd just proven something important. Not to the neighbors who'd doubted her, not to Daniel Brennan or Tom Fletcher or any of the people who'd watched her dig into a hillside and questioned her sanity. She'd proven it to herself that she could survive anything if she refused to accept the alternative. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the earth held steady at 56 degrees, and Maggie Thornhill slept with her dog beside a fire that would burn through the night because she'd been willing to face hell to keep it lit. The pounding on her door came at midnight on the second day of the storm. Maggie woke with the rifle in her hands before she was fully conscious, instinct and frontier living making her dangerous before she was capable of rational thought. Rusty was already at the door, growling low. "Who's there? Please." A man's voice, thin and desperate, barely audible through oak and earth and screaming wind. "Please, we saw smoke from your chimney. Please let us in." She approached the door with the rifle ready, years of living alone having taught her that desperation made people unpredictable. Unbarred it and pulled it open onto nightmare. 3 figures stood in the tunnel entrance, so covered in snow and ice they barely looked human. 2 adults she recognized after a moment as James and Elizabeth Morrison. Between them, held like something precious and fragile, their daughter Lucy. Behind them, the world was white chaos. A wall of blowing snow so dense Maggie couldn't see 5 feet past her doorframe. "Get inside, now!" They stumbled through, and she slammed the door against wind that tried to follow them inside, a living force that wanted what she had. Temperature in the chamber dropped 10 degrees in the seconds the door was open, and Maggie could feel cold trying to find purchase, trying to infiltrate the warmth she'd built. The Morrisons collapsed on her floor, shaking so violently they couldn't speak. Lucy was silent and still, and for a terrible moment Maggie thought the child was dead. Then the girl's eyes opened, focusing slowly on the fire, and she made a sound that was half sob and half moan of relief. Alive. They were all alive. Barely, but alive. Maggie worked quickly, blankets first, wrapping them in everything she could spare. Hot water from the kettle she kept simmering, spooned into mouths too cold to chew solid food. Then warm broth, forcing nutrition into bodies that had spent the last 6 hours fighting death and losing. She stripped their frozen outer clothes, replaced them with dry blankets, with quilts, with anything that would hold heat against skin that had nearly forgotten what warmth felt like. It took 6 hours before any of them could talk properly. James Morrison went first, his voice raw from cold and tears and breathing air that had tried to kill him. "Our house. The wind took the roof. Just peeled it off like paper. The walls started falling after that. We had to run." Elizabeth added details in fragments, each sentence requiring effort. "We saw your smoke. Didn't know where else to go. Everyone else too far. We never would have made it. How did you know about this place?" James tried to smile, but the expression faltered. "Everyone knows about the crazy widow who dug herself into a mountain. Doesn't seem so crazy now." Maggie looked at her small shelter designed for 1 woman and a dog now crowded with 4 bodies, and the accumulated terror of people who'd just survived the unsurvivable. "No, I suppose it doesn't." Lucy was the first to truly warm children's metabolisms, recovering faster than adults. She sat wrapped in Robert's old quilt, the one Maggie had made from his shirts after he died, and watched the fire with eyes that had seen too much for 6 years of living. "Mrs. Thornhill." Her voice was small but clear. "Is my pa going to die?" "No, sweetheart. Your pa is going to be fine. You're all going to be fine. You're safe now. How come you're not scared?" "Because I built this place to keep me safe from exactly this. And now it's keeping you safe too. That's what homes are supposed to do." The second wave arrived throughout the following day and night. Tom Fletcher first stumbling through the door around noon with hands so badly frostbitten he couldn't work his fingers. He'd followed fence lines for 6 miles, lost his horse to the cold, found Maggie's chimney smoke by pure chance when he'd been 20 minutes from lying down and giving up. Then old Dawson, the prospector who'd warned her the cold was gathering strength. He'd been caught in the open when the temperature dropped, followed her smoke signal for 2 miles through whiteout conditions using wilderness skills honed over 40 years to stay alive when men half his age were freezing in their beds. Then Anna Walsh, with her infant son Peter, refugees from a farmhouse that had become a death trap when the fireplace backed up completely and wouldn't draw at all. She'd wrapped Peter in everything she owned and walked into a blizzard because staying meant suffocating while freezing. By sunset of January 9th, Maggie's shelter held 8 people and a dog in a space designed for 1. They slept in shifts 3 or 4 at a time while others sat against walls or tended the fire or tried to keep fear from consuming them. Food supplies that should have lasted Maggie 6 weeks were being rationed to feed 8 mouths for however long this storm lasted. 3 days already, maybe 3 more, maybe longer. She did the calculations and didn't share them because spreading panic served no purpose. Tom Fletcher, who was only 19 and had never been this close to death before, wept quietly in the corner when he thought no one was watching. Old Dawson told stories of other winters he'd survived, each tale more harrowing than the last, though Maggie suspected he was exaggerating to give people something to focus on besides the roaring outside. Anna Walsh nursed Peter in the warmest corner near the fireplace, singing to him in a language Maggie didn't recognize. The baby, oblivious to catastrophe, slept and ate and cried with the uncomplicated demands of someone too young to understand that the world had nearly ended around him. Elizabeth Morrison wouldn't let go of Lucy's hand even when they slept. James sat against the wall with his frost-nipped fingers elevated, watching his daughter breathe and occasionally making sounds that might have been prayers. Maggie kept the fire burning, monitored the supplies, checked the chimney drawer every hour, and tried not to think about what would happen if the food ran out before the storm did. On the morning of the 3rd day, Tom Fletcher's guilt finally broke through. "Mrs. Thornhill, I need to tell you something. All of you." His voice carried across the shelter, stopping conversations, drawing attention. "I killed Mr. Thornhill, or I'm part of why he died." Maggie set down the firewood she'd been stacking. "Tom, we talked about this. They deserve to know. Everyone deserves to know." He looked at the Morrisons, at Anna Walsh, at old Dawson. "2 winters ago I stole tools from Robert Thornhill's barn. A saw chisels a hand drill. I was broke and stupid and I let him take the blame when things went missing. He was out checking trap lines looking for those tools when he fell and died. And 3 months ago I mocked Mrs. Thornhill when she started building this shelter. Called her crazy, same as everyone else. And now she saved my life anyway, even knowing what I did." The silence that followed was weighted with judgment and exhaustion and the strange clarity that comes from surviving impossible things. James Morrison spoke first. "Last month I told my daughter the sky was just cloudy when my wife said it looked wrong. I sent Lucy to school because I didn't want to believe a storm could be as bad as it turned out to be. If I'd listened, if I'd trusted my wife's instincts, we wouldn't have been outside when the roof came off. So I nearly killed my family through arrogance." Elizabeth added her confession. "I knew James was wrong. I saw that sky and knew it was dangerous, and I didn't fight hard enough to keep Lucy home because I wanted my husband to make the decision so I wouldn't have to take responsibility if something went wrong. So I nearly killed my daughter through cowardice." Anna Walsh's voice was quiet but steady. "My husband died because I told him to go into town to get medicine for Peter's cough when I should have known the weather was turning. He caught pneumonia on that trip and died 3 days later. So I killed my husband through impatience." Old Dawson laughed, a dry sound without humor. "Hell, I've outlived 3 wives, 2 sons, and more friends than I can count. Most of them died because I was somewhere else when they needed help. Survivor's guilt is just the price of living when others don't. You either carry it or it carries you." Maggie looked at these people sharing space and warmth and confessions in the underground chamber she'd built from determination and dirt. We all made choices. Some of them were good. Some of them were bad. And we're all alive right now because at some point I made the choice to build this shelter and you made the choice to find it. That's what matters. Not what we did wrong. What we do with the time we've been given. Tom wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I don't deserve forgiveness. Then earn it." Maggie's voice carried the authority of someone who'd built something from nothing and refused to let it fail. "Stay alive. Learn from this. Teach others. Make your survival mean something. That's the only thing any of us can do." Morning of the fourth day. Old Dawson studied their diminishing food supplies with the calculating gaze of someone who'd rationed provisions through lean times before. "We got maybe 4 days left if this storm keeps up. 6 if we cut portions to half." Mrs. Thornhill's supplies weren't meant to feed 8 people. Anna Walsh's baby chose that moment to start crying, the thin wail of an infant who could sense stress in his mother even if he couldn't understand it. We could split up. Tom Fletcher's suggestion carried the weight of someone volunteering for sacrifice. "Send some of us to another shelter if there is one. Make room for the ones who need it most." Maggie's mind raced through possibilities. Daniel Brennan had built his own shelter larger than hers, better stocked, because he'd learned from her mistakes. His ranch was only 1.5 miles west. But traveling in this storm meant near certain death, and she had no way to know if his shelter had survived or if he was even there. Unless someone tried. "I know another shelter. Daniel Brennan built one on his ranch using the same design as this. It's bigger, has more supplies, but it's 1.5 miles through conditions that killed 17 people in this county already." How many could make it? James Morrison had the look of a man calculating acceptable losses. Strong ones might survive with luck and guidance. Women and children wouldn't. "Then we send the men." Old Dawson's logic was brutal but sound. 3 of us walk to Brennan's shelter if it exists. That leaves you women and children here with more food and more space. We live or we don't, but either way we improve everyone's odds. You could die 10 feet from this door and never find your way back. Could die here slow from starvation too. At least this way we're trying. Maggie looked at the 3 men volunteering to walk into a storm that had already proven itself capable of killing anyone foolish enough to challenge it. Looked at Elizabeth Morrison and Anna Walsh and Lucy, who needed the space and food more than pride needed protecting. If you go roped together. You take the compass even though it's probably useless in these conditions. You mark your direction by wind and any landmarks you can feel since you won't be able to see. And you carry letters for Brennan explaining the situation so if you make it and he's there, he knows to send help. We leave in 1 hour. Tom Fletcher stood, decision made. Before I lose my nerve. They prepared with the efficiency of people who understood that hesitation killed. 3 men roped together at 10-foot intervals. Old Dawson at the front because his 40 years in these mountains had earned him the right to lead. Tom in the middle. James Morrison at the rear, the last connection to safety. Each man carried a letter Maggie had written explaining the situation, the location of her shelter, the number of people sheltering, and their conditions. If one man died, maybe another would make it through with the message. Maggie watched them prepare and felt the weight of command settling on her shoulders. She'd built this shelter. She'd saved these lives. And now she was sending 3 of them into conditions that might kill them, gambling that Brennan's shelter existed and was occupied and could send rescue. The alternative was watching everyone slowly starve. Sometimes bad choices were the only choices available. They left at 10 o'clock in the morning, stepping from warmth into chaos, and the door slammed shut on wind that sounded like judgment. 4 hours of not knowing. Elizabeth Morrison prayed. Anna Walsh nursed Peter and sang to him and tried not to let fear seep into the milk. Lucy slept curled in blankets, exhausted by terror and the resilience of childhood. Rusty paced the entrance tunnel, whining softly, sensing that pack members had left and might not return. Maggie kept the fire burning, monitored the chimney, counted and recounted the remaining food supplies, calculated how long 4 people could survive on what was left, tried not to imagine 3 frozen bodies roped together found by spring thaw. At 2:30 in the afternoon, someone knocked on the door with a pattern that wasn't wind or ice. 3 measured strikes. Paused 2 more. Maggie grabbed the rifle, heart hammering. "Who's there, Daniel Brennan?" "Mrs. Thornhill. Tom Fletcher and 2 others are safe in my shelter. I came to bring you and the women and children there." She opened the door to find Brennan standing in her entrance tunnel covered in snow, but alive, competent, and offering salvation. They made it barely. Old Dawson's got frostbite on both feet. James Morrison's fingers are bad. Tom Fletcher might lose part of his nose, but they're alive and warming up. He looked past Maggie to the women and child in the chamber beyond. My shelter's 15 by 12. I've got supplies for 6 months. There's room for all of you and comfort besides. But we have to go now while I can still find my way back. It's 1.5 miles in a blizzard. I made it here, didn't I? We rope up, we move slow, we trust each other. Same as your men trusted me to come get you. Maggie looked at Elizabeth Morrison, at Anna Walsh, at Lucy, who was too young to walk 1.5 miles in the best of conditions, let alone a whiteout at 40 below. Looked at Brennan, who'd ridden over to mock her when she started digging, and had now walked through hell to rescue people he'd never met because she'd taught him how to build shelter and he'd learned the lesson completely. We're doing this on your count, Mr. Brennan. You lead, we follow, and if anyone falls, we all stop until they're up again. Fair terms, Mrs. Thornhill. Now get these people ready. We're burning daylight we don't have. The journey was 45 minutes of sustained horror. Brennan led with a rope around his waist, Maggie following with Lucy strapped to her back in a makeshift sling, Elizabeth next, Anna last, with Peter, wrapped in so many layers he looked like a bundle of fabric instead of a human infant. They moved through white chaos where direction was meaningless and distance impossible to judge. The rope connecting them was the only thing preventing them from scattering and dying separately. Wind that knocked them sideways, cold that attacked exposed skin with surgical precision, snow that accumulated on their backs and shoulders, adding weight that threatened to pull them down. Lucy whimpered once against Maggie's back, then went silent, and Maggie couldn't tell if the child had passed out or was being brave or had frozen against her spine. Elizabeth stumbled twice, caught by the rope and Maggie's backward reach. Anna fell, once went to her knees holding Peter above the snow, and Brennan stopped them all until she could stand and signal readiness. They covered 1.5 miles in 45 minutes, and it felt like dying slowly in all the ways that mattered. When they reached Brennan's shelter entrance, Maggie's legs wouldn't hold her weight anymore. She fell against the tunnel wall and slid to the floor, and Brennan had to carry her and Lucy the last 20 feet into warmth. Brennan's shelter was everything he'd promised. Larger than Maggie's, reinforced with double beams, stocked with supplies that spoke of a man who'd learned from someone else's hard lessons and applied them completely. The chamber already held Tom Fletcher, James Morrison, and old Dawson in various states of recovery from their crossing. Elizabeth and James Morrison found each other, held each other, checked Lucy, who was cold and scared but fundamentally intact. Anna Walsh collapsed in the warmest corner and unwrapped Peter, who started crying immediately, the best sound anyone had heard in days, because it meant he was alive enough to complain. Maggie sat against the wall, trying to stop shaking, and Daniel Brennan brought her hot broth and blankets and a look that said he understood exactly what she'd just risked. "Thank you for teaching me how to build this. Thank you for coming to get us. We saved each other, Mrs. Thornhill. That's what neighbors do." Night of the 4th day. 2 shelters active, connected by human courage and Maggie's knowledge that had spread from one woman's determination to a community's salvation. 8 people who should have died were learning what it meant to be saved by the thing everyone had mocked. Maggie sat in Brennan's larger chamber, Rusty at her feet, and listened to the storm continue its assault above. The earth held steady at 56 degrees. The fire drew perfectly through a chimney built to her specifications. The people around her were warming, eating, beginning to believe they might actually survive. Daniel Brennan settled beside her with the exhausted satisfaction of a man who'd built something that mattered. "How many died out there, you think? Hundreds?" Maggie's voice was quiet. "Maybe more. We'll count them when the thaw comes, but not us. No, not us." The 5th day brought continued wind and cold, but no new refugees. The 8th person in their collective survival was alive because Maggie Thornhill had refused to be sensible, had dug into a hillside while everyone laughed, and had built something that worked when everything else failed. On the morning of January 10th, the wind stopped. Maggie opened Brennan's shelter door to silence so profound It felt like violence in reverse. Clear blue sky, temperature risen to merely bitter. Snow drifted 15 feet high in alien sculptures that spoke of wind that had blown without mercy for 3 days straight. One by one they emerged, blinked in sunlight that felt obscene after darkness and fear, stood in a landscape transformed into something that barely resembled the world they'd known before the storm arrived. Old Dawson spoke first, his voice carrying across snow that muffled everything. How did anyone survive this? They didn't. Maggie looked at the horizon where other homesteads stood silent, no smoke rising, no signs of life. Not everyone, not even most. But we did, and that's going to have to be enough. The counting began on January 11th. Sheriff Theodore Marsh rode from claim to claim across the county documenting what the storm had taken, 17 bodies in his jurisdiction alone. By the time neighboring counties reported their numbers, the total climbed past 300 across Montana Territory and the Dakotas. Families frozen in their homes when heating failed, children who'd tried to walk from school and made it halfway. Travelers caught between towns found weeks later when the snow receded enough to reveal what winter had claimed. Cattle by the thousands standing frozen in fields where they'd huddled for warmth that never came. The survivors emerged from whatever shelter they'd found and began the grim work of recovery, digging out collapsed buildings, accounting for the missing, burying the dead in ground still frozen too hard for proper graves, and asking the question that mattered most: how did anyone survive? The answer kept leading back to a widow who'd dug herself into a hillside while everyone called her crazy. First came the newspaper reporters from Helena, drawn by accounts of 8 people surviving in an underground shelter when conventional homes had failed catastrophically. They wanted to see Maggie's chamber, wanted to understand the engineering that had held when timber roofs and stone chimneys collapsed under snow weight and wind force. She showed them reluctantly. Explained the principles of earth insulation and thermal mass with the same matter-of-fact tone she'd used teaching herself. Yes, the temperature stays constant year-round. No, it's not magic, it's geology. The earth doesn't care what the surface weather does. The reporters wrote their stories with the breathless enthusiasm of people who'd discovered something remarkable. Pioneer woman's underground home saves 8 lives during historic blizzard. The article spread across territorial newspapers, then Eastern papers, each retelling adding layers of mythology Maggie didn't recognize. They made her sound heroic. She'd just been practical. The territorial governor mentioned her in a speech about preparedness and frontier resilience, holding her up as an example of the kind of innovation that built civilizations in hostile territory. Maggie wasn't there to hear it, but word reached her through visitors who started arriving at her claim with increasing frequency. Some came to gawk. She turned those away with the kind of frontier directness that didn't waste words on politeness. This isn't a carnival attraction. This is my home. Others came to learn. Those she welcomed. A rancher from 30 miles north who'd lost half his herd wanted to understand underground storage that could protect hay and grain from moisture while maintaining stable temperature. A widow from the next county over asked questions about building alone, about whether a woman without a husband's help could accomplish what Maggie had done. A young couple expecting their first child wanted to know if they could build something similar before next winter came. Maggie answered every genuine question, drew diagrams, explained her mistakes so others wouldn't repeat them, shared the knowledge she'd paid for in blistered hands and nearly dying on a frozen hillside because keeping it to herself served no purpose beyond pride. Knowledge isn't like gold. The thought crystallized into words one afternoon while teaching a farmer's wife about load-bearing beam placement. Gold gets smaller when you share it. Knowledge gets bigger. Every person who learns from me and teaches someone else makes the whole community stronger. By late February, Daniel Brennan had become something unexpected, her advocate in a community that still struggled with the idea that a woman could know more than men about construction and survival. When Samuel Grissom at the trading post suggested that Maggie's shelter had only succeeded through luck, Brennan corrected him publicly. Luck didn't calculate beam load. Luck didn't design ventilation systems that prevented smoke backup. Thornhill knew what she was doing, which is more than most of us can say about our own houses. When Katherine Jensen implied that a proper woman wouldn't be living alone on a remote claim teaching men about building, Brennan's response carried weight. Mrs. Thornhill buried her husband and built shelter that saved 8 lives, including your neighbors, the Morrisons. What did you build this winter besides opinions? The friendship that developed between them was platonic and practical, built on mutual respect between two people who understood loss and had responded by building things that mattered. Brennan had lost his wife in childbirth 3 years before Robert died. He understood the specific loneliness of frontier widowhood, the way community sympathy evaporated fast when you couldn't remarry and return to conventional patterns. They consulted on each other's projects. She helped him design better livestock shelters. He used his standing as a male property owner to open doors. She couldn't access territorial legislature meetings, funding requests for disaster, preparedness conversations where women's voices were dismissed, but men's were heard. Not romance, partnership. The kind that survives because both parties need each other's strengths without diminishing their own. March brought the first formal request for instruction. 17 people, farmers, ranchers, townspeople who'd lost homes or family members in the blizzard, signed a petition asking Maggie to teach a class in earth-sheltered construction. She'd never taught anything before. Had barely attended school herself before leaving Cornwall at age 12 to work in her uncle's household. The idea of standing before 17 people and transferring knowledge felt presumptuous until she remembered she was the only one who'd done this successfully. Pride wasn't relevant. Results were. The first class met in early April at her shelter, students arriving on horseback and wagon throughout the morning. Ages ranged from 22 to 64, 11 men, 6 women, all of them carrying the weight of winter that had taught them conventional wisdom could kill you. Maggie started with site selection, showed them how to read soil composition, evaluate drainage, assess hillside stability, explained why she'd chosen this location, southern exposure for the entrance clay substrate that held form elevation that prevented spring flooding. Then, excavation techniques, how to dig at angles that prevented collapse, why the entrance tunnel sloped upward, the mathematics of chamber dimensions relative to intended occupancy and use. By lunch, 3 students had given up, overwhelmed by complexity they hadn't anticipated. The remaining 14 stayed through afternoon sessions on shoring and ventilation and waterproofing with clay straw mixture. Tom Fletcher, who'd helped Maggie rebuild after the ceiling collapse, became her assistant teacher without being asked. He demonstrated beam notching, explained load distribution in terms that connected to barn building and fence posting that ranchers already understood, made the knowledge accessible instead of academic. At sunset, when the last student rode away, Maggie sat at her shelter entrance with exhaustion that felt earned instead of defeating. Rusty leaned against her leg, content in the way dogs are when their humans have accomplished something important. 14 people now knew what she knew, would teach others, would adapt and improve and spread the knowledge until earth-sheltered construction stopped being the crazy widow's folly and became standard frontier practice. She'd just changed something bigger than herself. By autumn of 1888, 8 new underground shelters had been completed in the valley. Each one reflected Maggie's core principles: earth insulation, proper ventilation, reinforced shoring, but adapted to individual needs and circumstances. A Swedish immigrant named Lars Lindquist built one with superior moisture control, having dealt with damp climates in his homeland and understanding humidity management better than Montana-raised builders. His innovation involved double-wall construction with air gaps that prevented condensation from forming on interior surfaces. A former Army engineer named Captain William Brooks created standardized plans that even inexperienced builders could follow. He reduced Maggie's design to measurements and procedures, removing the need for intuitive understanding that had made her original construction so difficult to replicate. A family of Norwegian settlers combined underground principles with sod roof techniques from their homeland, creating hybrid structures that worked brilliantly in specific soil conditions where pure excavation would have failed. Maggie visited each new shelter when she could, offered advice, learned from their innovations, incorporated improvements into her teaching so each new student benefited from accumulated wisdom of everyone who'd come before. The knowledge was evolving, growing beyond what any single person could have developed alone. That's what happened when you shared instead of hoarded. By spring of 1889, the technique had spread beyond Maggie's immediate valley. 20 shelters across northern Montana with requests for instruction coming from the Dakota Territory and Wyoming. Word traveled through letters, through territorial newspapers, through the kind of desperate information sharing that happened when people realized conventional approaches would kill them eventually. Maggie expanded her teaching schedule, held classes monthly instead of seasonally, trained the best students to teach others, creating a network of knowledge that could spread faster than she could travel. She never charged for the teaching, accepted donations when people offered firewood food labor on projects she couldn't complete alone. But the knowledge itself she gave away freely. It seemed wrong to profit from survival, wrong to put a price on something that might mean the difference between life and death for someone else's family. Daniel Brennan argued with her about it one evening in spring of 1890, both of them sitting at her shelter entrance watching sunset paint the mountains gold. You could be wealthy. You could patent the design, charge licensing fees, build an empire on this. I'm already wealthy. I have a home that keeps me warm. I have work that matters. I have a dog who loves me and neighbors who respect me. What else does a woman need? Security. Comfort in old age. I have security. Maggie gestured at the hillside around them, at earth that had proven itself stronger than timber and stone. This won't fail because markets crash or husbands die or communities decide I'm not worth helping. This is mine because I built it, and it'll keep me alive as long as I maintain it properly. Brennan had no counter-argument for that. 1892 brought Maggie's 40th birthday and the realization that she'd been teaching earth shelter construction for 4 years. More than 50 structures now existed across 3 territories, all descended from the principles she'd developed through trial and error and desperate necessity. The community had changed around her. Tom Fletcher had built his own shelter and married a woman from town who appreciated his skills more than his past mistakes. The Morrison family thrived in a new home that incorporated underground storage using Maggie's designs. Anna Walsh had remarried to a widower who'd lost his family in the blizzard and understood grief as foundation rather than obstacle. Old Dawson still prospected the mountains, but he wintered in a small underground shelter he'd built himself using techniques Maggie had taught him. At 73, he had no intention of freezing in a tent ever again. Daniel Brennan expanded his ranch using underground structures for livestock shelter and supply storage in ways that increased his operations efficiency beyond what conventional buildings allowed. He credited Maggie publicly and often making sure anyone who bought cattle from him knew where the innovations originated. Rusty died in autumn of 1902. He'd been with Maggie for 17 years, from the first swing of her pickaxe through every winter and spring and summer that followed. Had guarded her while she dug, had saved her life by fetching Tom Fletcher during the ceiling collapse, had welcomed every refugee who stumbled to their door during the blizzard. He died in his sleep beside the fireplace in the spot he'd claimed that first night she moved into the shelter. Went peacefully as old dogs do when they've lived well and been loved completely. Maggie buried him on the hilltop where her chimney smoke rose and dispersed into mountain air. Marked his grave with a stone she carved herself, Rusty. He was there at the beginning. She got another dog within a month. A cattle dog mix someone was giving away in town, clever and energetic and nothing like Rusty. She named him Copper, and he learned the shelter's rhythms and claimed his own spot, and became his own dog instead of trying to replace what had been lost. There would always be a dog by her fire. That was a decision she'd made and would maintain as long as she lived. The early 1900s brought electricity to some parts of Montana, though not to Maggie's remote claim. She didn't mind. Her shelter operated on principles that predated electricity and would outlast it. Earth fire human engineering applied with precision and maintained with care. She continued teaching, though less frequently now, as other instructors she'd trained took over most classes. Her role evolved from active teacher to consultant and elder stateswoman of a movement she'd started accidentally by refusing to freeze in a badly built cabin. Students sought her out for difficult problems. How to build in rocky soil where excavation seemed impossible. how to adapt underground construction to flood-prone areas, how to incorporate modern materials like concrete and steel without sacrificing the thermal advantages of earth insulation. She answered questions when she could, admitted ignorance when she couldn't, and encouraged students to experiment and share results, so the collective knowledge continued growing. 1914 brought war to Europe, and with it, the strangest application of Maggie's knowledge she'd ever encountered. A military engineer visited her shelter that autumn, asking detailed questions about underground construction, load-bearing under heavy stress ventilation in enclosed spaces with limited air circulation. "Why do you need to know this trench warfare? The fighting in France is all happening underground now. Soldiers digging into earth to survive artillery bombardment. But they're dying from cave-ins and bad air and flooding. Your techniques could save lives." Maggie sat with that information for a long moment. She'd built a shelter to survive Montana winter. Now men were using the same principles to survive human violence on a different continent. "Show me your current designs. I'll tell you where they're failing." She spent 3 days working with the engineer, pointing out structural weaknesses and ventilation problems and drainage issues that would kill soldiers as surely as enemy fire. She didn't ask whether her advice would be used to save American lives or Allied lives, or whether the enemy might learn the same techniques. Men were dying underground because of poor engineering, and she knew how to fix it. War was terrible. Preventable death was worse. The 1920s arrived with Maggie in her late 60s, still living in the shelter she'd built 33 years earlier. The structure had required maintenance over the decades, beam replacements, chimney repairs, waterproofing updates, but the fundamental design remained sound. The territory had become a state. Automobiles were replacing horses on roads that had been expanded and improved. Radio brought voices from distant cities into homes that had electricity and indoor plumbing, and conveniences Maggie had never possessed and didn't particularly want. She'd lived most of her life in a hole in the ground by choice and had no regrets about it. Daniel Brennan visited regularly, both of them aging into the comfortable friendship of people who'd survived too much to waste time on pretense. He was 74 now, white-haired and slowed by arthritis, but still ranching because stopping meant dying, and he wasn't ready for that. They sat at her shelter entrance one October afternoon, watching light fade from mountains they'd both watched for decades. "You ever think about what happens to this place after you're gone? Someone will maintain it, or they won't. Either way, I'll be past caring. The Historical Society's been asking about it. Want to preserve it as an example of pioneer innovation." Maggie laughed. "Pioneer innovation. I dug a hole to keep from freezing. That's not innovation, that's common sense finally winning an argument with stupidity. You changed how people build in this territory. That matters. Maybe. Or maybe I just survived when others didn't, and people made me important because they needed someone to be." November of 1923 brought the knowing. Maggie woke one morning with the certainty that she was dying not from any specific illness, but from the accumulated weight of 67 years of living hard in territory that didn't forgive weakness. Her body was giving out, joints that ached more than they worked, breathing that came harder each winter, exhaustion that sleep didn't cure anymore. She'd built this home to die warm in, might as well use it for its intended purpose. She told Daniel Brennan first on one of his visits in early December. He tried to argue her into seeing a doctor in town, getting proper medical care, fighting instead of accepting. Fighting what, Mr. Brennan? Being 67 in a place that kills younger people regularly. I've had a good run. I'm not afraid of how it ends. You can't just decide to die. Why not? I decided to live when everyone said I was being foolish. Seems fair I get to decide when I'm done. He rode away angry, came back 3 days later, apologetic, and they didn't discuss it again because some arguments have no winners. The winter of 1923 into 24 was mild by Montana standards, temperatures staying above zero most days, snow manageable instead of catastrophic. Maggie spent it in her shelter tending her fire and reading books she'd collected over decades, and occasionally receiving visitors who'd heard she was declining and wanted to pay respects. Tom Fletcher came with his wife and 3 children, the youngest of whom had been born in a house built using techniques Maggie had taught Tom's father. She's never seen this shelter. Tom's voice carried pride. Wanted her to meet the woman who saved my life twice. The girl, maybe 8 years old, looked around the earthen chamber with wide eyes. You really dug all this yourself? I did. Why? Because the house I had was going to kill me, and I refused to die from other people's poor planning. That made sense to the girl in ways adult explanations wouldn't have. Anna Walsh visited in December, bringing her teenage sons and the baby she'd saved during the blizzard, who was now a sturdy 15-year-old named Peter. He didn't remember the storm or the shelter or the 3 days his mother had spent terrified he wouldn't survive. But Anna remembered. You saved his life, Mrs. Thornhill. Saved mine, too. I wouldn't have made it alone with a baby in that storm. You made it because you refused to stay in a house that was killing you. I just provided the destination. Still, you gave me somewhere to go when nowhere else existed. Lucy Morrison came with her parents in early January. She was 42 now, married with children of her own, carrying none of the trauma you'd expect from a 6-year-old who'd nearly frozen to death. Her parents had made sure of that, turning the blizzard into a story about survival instead of victimhood. I don't remember much about those 3 days. Lucy's voice was thoughtful rather than apologetic. I remember being cold, then being warm. I remember you telling me I was safe. Were you scared? Terrified. But you weren't. So I figured maybe it would be okay. Maggie smiled at that. I was terrified too. I just hid it better because you were watching. January 12, 1924. 36 years and 2 days after the Great Blizzard. Maggie woke knowing this was the last time she'd wake. Not from pain or dramatic symptoms, just from the gentle certainty that her body was done with the business of living and ready to stop. She fed Copper, stoked the fire one final time, arranged herself in the bed she'd built with her own hands in the room she'd carved from Hillside while everyone told her she was crazy. The earth wrapped around her, holding warmth close the way it had for 3 decades. 56 degrees constant and reliable, asking nothing and taking nothing, and simply being there the way good shelter should be. She thought about Robert briefly, wondered if he could see what she'd built, what she'd become, how the shelter he'd thought foolish had saved lives and changed communities and would outlast both of them by generations. She thought about the 8 people who'd stumbled to her door during the blizzard. How many of them were still alive because she'd refused to accept that winter could kill her if she just dug deep enough. She thought about all the students she'd taught, all the shelters they'd built, all the knowledge spreading across territories like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Not a bad legacy for a widow who'd been too stubborn to do what sensible people did. Copper whined softly, sensing something changing. Maggie reached down to scratch his ears one last time. You're a good dog. Someone will take care of you. She closed her eyes. The fire crackled. The earth held steady at the temperature it had maintained since long before humans started building and would maintain long after they stopped. Maggie Thornhill died warm in the home she'd built, surrounded by proof that listening to your own wisdom when everyone else's wisdom failed was not just survival, but victory. They buried her on the hilltop beside Rusty at her own request. The grave marker was simple. Margaret Thornhill, 1856 to 1924. She dug deep and found warmth. 300 people attended, despite temperature at 20 below zero. Every one of them had been saved by her knowledge, either directly or indirectly, had built shelter using principles she'd developed, had learned that the surface world was hostile and deadly, but dig deep enough and you found something else. Daniel Brennan spoke at the service, his voice carrying across frozen ground to people who stood listening because she'd been worth freezing for. Mrs. Thornhill taught me that being wrong was survivable. Being too proud to learn from someone smarter than you was what killed you. She was smarter than all of us and generous enough to share what she knew, even when we mocked her for it. We're alive because she refused to accept that freezing was inevitable. That's worth remembering. The shelter still stands, maintained by the Montana Historical Society as an example of frontier ingenuity and the kind of practical wisdom that built civilizations in places actively hostile to human survival. Visitors can walk through the entrance tunnel, duck through the timber-framed doorway, stand in the oval chamber where 8 people survived the worst blizzard in territorial history. The fireplace still works. The spring still seeps through its crack in the rock. The earthen walls still hold steady at 56 degrees year-round, just like Maggie said they would. Guides tell her story to every group that passes through. Explain the physics of earth insulation and thermal mass. Detail the historical context and the death toll and the woman who'd been mocked for digging a hole and ended up saving a community. But the part that resonates most, the part visitors remember after forgetting technical details, is simpler than physics or engineering. It's about a widow who lost everything and built something new, about facing an impossible winter and carving out space where impossible didn't apply, about listening to her own wisdom when everyone else's wisdom had proven fatal. They told her she was digging her own grave, told her she was crazy foolish wasting her time on a fantasy that would collapse around her. She kept digging anyway. And when the storm came that killed 300 people, that buried houses and froze cattle and turned the prairie into frozen hell, she was warm. She was safe. She was alive. So were the 8 people who found their way to her door, drawn by smoke from a chimney that rose from a hillside, the only sign of life in a world that had surrendered to cold. Some lessons take generations to learn. Some people never learn them at all. But Maggie knew. Maggie had always known. The surface world is hostile, unpredictable, deadly. But dig deep enough and you find something else. You find warmth. You find shelter. You find home. All you have to do is keep swinging.